The modern world promises us knowledge, progress, and freedom, but delivers exactly the opposite.
Every day we are pushed toward distraction, toward emptiness, toward superficiality. Why do brilliant minds surrender to stupidity? Why does wisdom seem to be dying before our eyes? In this video, you will discover the hidden mechanism that transforms millions into followers of emptiness and how this is destroying human thought. If themes such as psychology, philosophy, and the darkness of the human soul interest you, subscribe to the channel now. We live in a world saturated with stimuli. Every second is filled with information, notifications, sounds, images, colors, and movements that compete incessantly for our attention. Our brains, which evolved to deal with complexity in a selective and concentrated way, are now forced to process a constant avalanche of superficial data. The mind was not designed for so much fragmentation. Excess does not educate, does not expand, does not awaken. It wears down. Continuous exposure to the trivial and shallow creates cognitive fatigue that blunts reflection and anesthetizes curiosity. Intelligence, which flourishes in contemplation and silence, is reduced to quick and automatic reactions, to responses conditioned to immediacy. The overload of information creates an illusion of knowledge. We are connected, but we are not understanding. We consume, but we do not process. Every notification becomes a small scream demanding attention and producing dopamine. This cycle turns the brain into a hostage of instant reward. The mind, constantly entertained, loses the ability to go deeper, to confront the complex, to question the obvious. Excess is not just a detail of modernity. It is the engine that transforms reflective individuals into anesthetized spectators, fascinated by the spectacle of emptiness. More than mental fatigue, excess creates an existential void. The time needed to think, to face one's own silence, to deal with the frustration of doubt simply disappears. There is no space for introspection. There is no space for questioning. Banality invades the soul, filling the space that was once dedicated to contemplation, ethics, beauty, and meaning. Thus, stupidity settles in not as a defect, but as a natural consequence of a life saturated with irrelevant stimuli, with content that consumes but does not transform. Permanent distraction works like symbolic anesthesia. The mind distances itself from the essential, avoiding confrontation with its own fragility, with the lack of meaning, with the responsibility to think and choose. Everything that requires cognitive or emotional effort is avoided. The noise, the surface, the excess become protection, not against the world, but against oneself. Stupidity in this context is not an accident, it is a refuge. It is the comfort of not having to face the human condition, of not having to challenge the mediocrity that has become natural. Excess fragments the perception of time. Every ephemeral stimulus pushes us toward urgency and immediacy. The rush is not accidental. It is part of the structure that keeps the mind busy and incapable of deep reflection. When everything has to be fast, when every minute is filled with distractions, there is no room to question what is presented to us, to discern manipulations, or even to develop critical awareness about our own behavior. Superficiality becomes a standard of life, and critical thinking becomes an inaccessible luxury. In addition, excess favors the consumption of banality as currency of belonging. Following trends, interacting with memes, reacting to posts, and sensationalist news creates an illusory sense of social inclusion. The mind, saturated with stimuli, seeks comfort in repetition and conformity. This search creates a mass of individuals who confuse participation with reflection, presence with authenticity. Collective stupidity arises not by chance, but by the engineering of excess. The more distracted and fragmented we are, the more predictable and controllable we become. Historically, culture valued solid symbolic systems. Religion, philosophy, science, and art structured the mind and gave meaning to existence. Today, these pillars are in crisis, and excess replaces meaning with mere consumption of stimuli. Continuous exposure to information without density prevents the construction of solid values, displacing the human being from depth to superficiality. Becoming dumb is not a chance of evolution. It is a direct consequence of a society that prioritizes quantity over quality, appearance over meaning. Finally, excess not only makes us dumb, it shapes character. Those who get used to living in noise and rush and distraction learn to react without reflecting, to accept without questioning, to value the shallow instead of the deep. This process, when repeated en masse, reorganizes cultural values, shapes the collective imagination, and creates citizens incapable of sustaining ideas, resisting manipulation, or exercising ethical autonomy. The exalted stupidity is not only the effect of individual choice, it is the inevitable consequence of a system that turns excess into a prison of the mind and superficiality into social norm. In the world saturated by excess, new myths emerge: the influencers. They are not just people who share images or videos, they are symbols of belonging, substitutes for a transcendence that has disappeared. In a society that has lost solid references, they offer the comfort of immediate recognition, the illusion of community, the sensation that life can be lived without reflection. Every post, every story, every selfie is a capsule of apparent meaning, and millions gather around it like devotees, consuming emptiness as if it were essence. The fascination they exert does not depend on the depth of their ideas, but on the ability to project an idealized image of existence. The girl who shows her aesthetic routine, the young man who turns his body into spectacle, the couple who stage the perfect love, all offer a simplified narrative of what it means to be someone. We do not need to think, reflect, or confront our insecurities. We just need to follow, like, and imitate. In this sense, influence goes far beyond marketing. It shapes behaviors, patterns of desire, and expectations about what success, happiness, or value mean. These modern icons replace cultural and spiritual symbols that once gave meaning to life. Religion lost its power, politics became spectacle, science turned into bureaucracy. Influencers fill the void left by all this, offering symbolic substitutes that do not challenge, do not educate, do not transform. They create a world in which appearance becomes more important than substance, and perception more valuable than discernment. What was once sought with intellectual or spiritual effort is now delivered ready, packaged, and ready for consumption. The role of influencers is not innocent. They are fundamental pieces in a cultural architecture that prioritizes distraction over reflection. Every like, every view, every interaction reinforces the logic of immediacy and shallowness. Instead of questioning, people learn to react, to accept standards without criticism, to reproduce behaviors without awareness. The idolatry of the superficial strengthens a cycle of passivity where the mind ceases to create, to resist, and to question. Critical thinking, thus, is not only neglected, it is silently undermined. More than entertainment, influencers function as instructors of mental habits. They train attention toward the ephemeral, condition expectation to instant reward, and shape desire toward constant consumption. The repetition of these stimuli creates psychological dependence. We seek the dopamine of recognition, the instant pleasure of easy content, and abandon the frustration necessary to develop wisdom. Superficiality becomes the norm and depth an obstacle that few dare to face. In addition, these icons reinforce the illusion of belonging. By following routines, fads, and suggested behaviors, individuals feel they are part of something bigger without the need for true reflection or engagement. The sense of community is artificial, but enough to reduce the anxiety of isolation and emptiness. The problem is that this false inclusion has a price. The mind becomes complacent, critical sense weakens, and the individual learns to replace authenticity with performance, presence with visibility, substance with appearance. The cultural impact is profound. When millions of people reproduce habits and values shaped by superficiality, the collective imagination changes. Aesthetics replaces ethics, popularity replaces depth, spectacle replaces responsibility. Ideas lose space to performance, and stupidity ceases to be merely tolerable. It becomes desirable, celebrated, and exalted. The influence of influencers, therefore, goes beyond the digital. It transforms the very way we think, feel, and behave in the real world. In the end, influencers function as modern priests of a religion without transcendence. They guide the masses through superficial signs, offering security and instant pleasure, but keeping everyone away from what really matters: silence, reflection, confrontation with oneself. Following these icons is easy, comfortable, and rewarding. But it is precisely this ease that distances us from wisdom, from depth, and from the freedom to think for ourselves. The idolatry of the shallow is not just aesthetic, it is political, psychological, and existential. Zygmunt Bauman warned us, we live in a liquid modernity where nothing remains, everything flows, and nothing settles. The structures that once gave stability to human life, religion, politics, science, community, dissolve, leaving only form without substance. Every connection is temporary. Every bond is volatile. Every experience is ephemeral. Liquidity permeates existence, making depth an inaccessible luxury and reflection an almost heroic effort. In this scenario, stupidity becomes naturalized because the saturated mind prefers the shallow to the unstable challenge of confronting the essential. The future, which was once a horizon of hope and planning, has turned into a constant threat. Every choice seems uncertain, every path seems dangerous. The past, in turn, is not remembered as learning, but loaded with shame or regret. The present, flooded with fleeting images and stimuli, has become a field of incessant consumption. We buy experiences, we like moments, we follow trends not to be better, but to prove that we exist. In this empire of the ephemeral, wisdom withdraws, superficiality triumphs. Consumption today transcends the economic sphere and becomes an existential act. We do not just buy products, we buy identity, belonging, and validation. We like to feel alive, we follow to feel included, we join fads to feel that we belong. Every act of consumption replaces the search for meaning. The logic is clear: if everything flows and nothing remains, we must fill the void with something, even if it is superficial. Stupidity, then, is not only a consequence of excess, it is a tool of psychological survival. In this context, traditional symbols were replaced by empty icons. Influencers, digital celebrities, fads, and trends occupied the place of transcendence and reflection. Every carefully constructed image offers a substitute for values, ideas, and references that have been lost. Youth observe, imitate, and consume, learning that appearance is worth more than essence, that virality is worth more than knowledge, that spectacle is worth more than truth. The ephemeral becomes the rule and depth the exception. The impact of this liquidity on culture is devastating. When meaning becomes volatile, education loses strength. Politics becomes spectacle, science fragments into superficial data, and art turns into entertainment. The human mind, deprived of consistency and of time for contemplation, begins to react to immediate stimulus without reflection, without discernment. Stupidity, celebrated as lightness, becomes social norm, while wisdom, which requires effort, reflection, and patience, is marginalized and ignored. The ephemeral also shapes human relationships. Superficiality infiltrates social bonds, friendships, romances, and family networks. Everything has to be fast, visual, shareable. Intimacy is replaced by exhibition, empathy by likes, presence by performance. Liquidity turns the human being into a spectator of their own life, conditioned to react instead of acting, to consume experiences instead of living them. Stupidity emerges not only as distraction, but as a mode of existence imposed by circumstances. In addition, liquid modernity creates emotional and cognitive dependence. The saturated mind seeks instant gratification to fill the void left by the ephemeral. Every trend consumed, every like received, every notification ignored works as reinforcement of a cycle of superficiality. Depth and silence become uncomfortable, while distraction and spectacle become addictions. The result is predictable: a generation trained to react, not to think, to imitate, not to create, to accept, not to question. Finally, the empire of the ephemeral transforms the very perception of reality. Time fragments, value dilutes, experience dematerializes. In this context, stupidity is not only the effect of technology or distraction, it is the consequence of a system that promotes the temporary over the lasting, the superficial over the deep. Liquid modernity does not only make us dumb, it creates anesthetized human beings, fascinated by emptiness, trained to worship appearance, and fearful of silence. Wisdom in this empire has not disappeared. It has simply been pushed to the margins, waiting for those who still dare to face the ephemeral and seek the essential. The critical thinking, that capacity to question, analyze, and discern, is dying before our eyes. In a society saturated with excess information and superficiality, thinking deeply has become a luxury. Every news item, every post, every video competes for the mind's attention, turning reflection into a voluntary, almost heroic effort. The culture of spectacle does not just distract, it conditions the mind to accept the obvious, to repeat patterns, to react without reflecting. Criticism becomes uncomfortable and stupidity comfortable. When the mind is constantly occupied by the trivial, the exercise of doubt is weakened. Questioning authorities, analyzing arguments, confronting ideas. All of this requires time, patience, and courage. But the modern world promotes haste, instant reaction, and the superficiality of ready-made answers. The habit of reflecting is lost, and with it the ability to sustain one's own opinion. Banality becomes the norm, and manipulation becomes inevitable. Citizens who do not think are citizens, easy to guide, control, and exploit. The impact of the death of critical thinking extends beyond the individual. It shapes entire societies. Discernment-less voters choose leaders based on the aesthetics of discourse, empty charisma, simplistic slogans. Consumers buy products not for real value, but for emotional marketing and trend effect. Politics, economy, and culture become spectacles where audience matters. More than justice, appearance, more than ethics, and engagement, more than reflection. Stupidity is not a collective accident. It is a consequence of a system that prevents the mind from thinking. Education also suffers from this critical erosion. Schools, universities, and learning centers are pressured to adapt content to the speed of consumption, prioritizing quick information, instant tests, and superficial engagement. Intellectual curiosity, which requires investigation, contemplation, and questioning, is neglected. The capacity to argue, to reason, to interpret the world with depth becomes rare. What remains is training to react, repeat, and reproduce patterns imposed by the system. The death of critical thinking creates a vicious cycle. Without reflection, the individual becomes more susceptible to manipulation and distraction. Without discernment, they begin to accept ideologies and patterns without questioning. Without analysis, stupidity becomes social norm. And the more people adhere to this pattern, the more collective culture shapes itself toward the shallow, the immediate, and the superficial. Society then loses not only intelligence, but also autonomy, responsibility, and capacity for resistance. This absence of criticism also weakens ethics and morality. Without the ability to evaluate consequences, to discern right from wrong, or question norms, choices become impulsive and conditioned. Banality infiltrates political, economic, and social decisions. Stupidity ceases to be neutral. It becomes functional because it allows power structures to advance without resistance, manipulations to go unnoticed, and the individual to settle in the comfort of ignorance. The price of distraction is higher than it seems. The death of critical thinking also erodes creativity and innovation. Thinking deeply requires risk, facing doubt, and the capacity to resist the pressure of conformity. But in a world that rewards the immediate, the visual, and the viral intellectual, risk becomes unlikely. The mind adapts to predictability, quick reactions, and pattern reproduction. Creative talent, which arises from the courage to question and explore the unknown, is exhausted under the pressure of superficiality. Stupidity does not just dominate, it consumes human potential. In the end, critical thinking becomes an act of resistance. Every question, every deep analysis, every conscious reflection is a gesture of freedom in a world that wants passive minds. Those who dare to think challenge the system, break with the logic of spectacle, and reclaim the autonomy of consciousness. The death of critical thinking is not inevitable. It is optional and depends on individual courage to face excess, to slow down, to resist distraction, and to choose depth over shallowness. In the silence of reflection, salvation still exists. Modern evil no longer presents itself as visible monsters, explicit wars, or demonic figures. It manifests silently, daily, and often imperceptibly in the absence of reflection, in passivity, before injustice, in blind obedience to the rules of spectacle. Hannah Arendt had already shown that evil can arise from the inability to think, from the banality hidden in routine and automatic obedience. Today, this banality manifests when we accept distractions, superficialities, and excess. Stimuli without questioning, allowing power structures to remain untouched while our minds are anesthetized. Superficiality and excess become tools of evil. When the population adapts to constant distraction, it becomes manipulable. Media algorithms and social systems exploit this fragility, creating wars of attention, trivial rivalries, and empty entertainment that drain mental and emotional energy. While we discuss trivialities, major decisions are made, injustices are committed, and society is shaped without resistance. Evil does not need direct aggression. It flourishes in the negligence of consciousness and the abdication of critical thinking. The individual, saturated by excess and fascinated by spectacle, becomes an involuntary accomplice. Every like, every share, every adherence to empty patterns reinforces a system that values passivity, conformity, and superficiality. It is not a matter of conscious choice, but conditioning. Stupidity in this context is not just a cognitive failure, it is a failures. It is stupidity in this context is not just a cognitive failure, it is a failure. Functional weapon that sustains social and political structures that thrive while humanity is distracted by trivialities. In addition, the banality of modern evil infiltrates human relationships. The inability to think and reflect generates limited empathy, superficial judgments, and absence of ethical responsibility. People become reactive, driven by immediate stimuli and external influences, unable to sustain solid principles or question injustices. The culture of distraction and excess transforms citizens and individuals into passive, anesthetized observers, ready to accept others. Decisions without criticism are fertile ground for silent evil. In the end, resisting the banality of modern evil requires conscious effort. It is necessary to slow down, to think, to question, to confront one's own ignorance, and choose depth over shallowness. Every act of reflection, every gesture of critical awareness is a way to interrupt the cycle of manipulation and emptiness. The banality of evil is not inevitable. It flourishes in passivity and distraction. Awakening to thought and attention is the first step to reclaim autonomy, ethics, and a capacity to transform the world, even amidst the empire of the ephemeral and superficiality. The first step to reclaim depth is to slow down. In a world that rewards haste, distraction, and superficiality, stopping is an act of courage. Slowing down does not mean alienating oneself, but creating space for reflection. It allows the mind to breathe, for attention to focus on the essential, and for critical thinking to have time to flourish. Without this conscious pause, we remain trapped in the cycle of excess, consuming empty stimuli that make us dumb and distance us from wisdom. Silence is the second pillar of healing. Amid the constant noise of social media and urban life, silence becomes rare and precious. It allows us to question our own convictions, to face fears, to recognize illusions, and to contemplate the meaning of life. Depth is born in quiet, not in turmoil. Those who get used to living in noise, haste, and distraction lose the ability to perceive the invisible, the ideas that transform, the feelings that educate, the symbols that structure existence. Confronting oneself is the third step. Excess anesthetizes us, but introspection awakens us. It is necessary to face one's own ignorance, prejudices, mental laziness, and the illusions we build to escape discomfort. Depth requires courage to look inward and question behavior patterns, consumption habits, and internalized values. Only by confronting one's own superficiality is it possible to rebuild a critical, autonomous mind capable of resisting the allure of the ephemeral. Seeking what has real value, even when it does not shine or go viral, is the fourth element of the path. Dense books, art that disturbs, conversations that challenge spirituality that cannot be sold, all form the substance of a critical mind. Cultivating these experiences requires effort, constancy, and patience. There are no shortcuts. True value is built in the invisible, in that which silently transforms perception and strengthens character. The shallow may be pleasurable, but depth is liberating. Finally, resisting superficiality is an act of freedom and power. Every conscious choice, every moment of reflection, every resistance to excess restores autonomy over our minds and lives. Reclaiming depth is not only an individual act, it is a way to transform the world from the inside out. Amid the empire of the ephemeral and distraction, those who seek meaning, cultivate silence, and face their own interior become the true architects of wisdom, capable of surviving the stupidity exalted by the modern world. Deep down, the excess that surrounds us is not innocent. It is not just an accumulation of information, distractions, and stimuli. It is a silent weapon, a mechanism that makes us dumb while we believe we are connected and well-informed. The mind, suffocated by abundance of nothing, loses the capacity to think for itself. And when thought disappears, freedom disappears with it. That is why true intelligence is not in knowing more, but in knowing less and better. It is in learning to cut, filter, and eliminate. Because those who surrender to excess become its slaves, while those who free themselves from superficial abundance find clarity, focus, and inner power. It is not a fight against the world, but against the constant temptation to drown in that which lacks depth. Now the choice is yours. You can continue living numbed by excess, or you can open your eyes and take control of your own mind. If you felt that this video touched something inside, you subscribe to the channel. Here we do not seek the comfort of illusion, but the courage of truth. And with each new video, you will have a new weapon against the mediocrity the world tries to impose. Click subscribe and let us together build a mind that no excess can corrupt. These 2 videos in front of you are not here by chance. And what if everything you believe about yourself is only a reflection of someone else's gaze? Click now on one of the videos beside and start breaking this mirror. You will have to risk the click. Which one will you choose?